Attrition played a great part during the Napoleonic Wars. It was a constant factor that every army had to take into consideration and decided some campaigns. The campaign attrition had the biggest impact on, without a doubt, was the Russian campaign in 1812. Attrition played a huge part in it, and it shaped how it developed. Spain also stands out as a great example of attrition, just on a much longer time frame than in comparison to Russia. Attrition is different during the Napoleonic period. It's much more manpower demanding and less demanding on equipment. Now, I'm not going to cover the attrition leading up to the campaign, but Napoleon spent an immense amount of effort gathering supplies, men, equipment for the invasion, some of which had to walk all the way from Spain to the border of Russia. From the moment the invasion began, the army began to struggle with certain issues. Supplies was a major factor during the entire campaign, and though it started out okay, even at the very beginning there were issues. Unlike much of the rest of Europe, Russia had a much lower level of infrastructure than the French were used to in, say, Poland or Prussia. What this meant is that the roads were fewer in number and became muddy very quickly as the huge army under Napoleon had to travel across them. It also meant that the populations were spread out across the vast Russian territory, meaning that even without the scorched earth that the Russians quickly began to implement, the French army could not live off the land to the same extent that they could before. Attrition was a major factor from the onset of the campaign. Forced marches to pursue the Russians, who were in a near constant state of retreat, just put further strain on the already stretched supply lines. Many men struggled to feed themselves and had to fall back on trying to get food however they could from the land around them. As more men dropped out, parts of the army began to become unorganized, and this only got worse as time went on. Sickness also played a major factor during the march. Many men contracted typhus or other diseases that meant that they were unable to fight and had to drop out, many of whom might have not returned to their units after recovering. Fresh supplies were constantly being transported to the army as it advanced deeper into Russia. Even the supply lines, however, suffered from attrition. Many horses were lost to attrition as they could not be fed or overworked trying to supply the army. This lack of horses would also play a major part in the army itself, as horses had a higher rate of attrition than men. Making everything worse were constant attacks by Cossacks and partisans on French supply lines, making it incredibly difficult to get supplies all the way to the head of the army as it grew closer and closer to Moscow. Even before reaching Moscow, Napoleon had lost the majority of his army, both to battles, but also to attrition, and the attrition killed many more men than the battles themselves. The invasion could already be considered a failure before it even reached Moscow. So many men, so much material had been lost, and the Russians still hadn't surrendered. The only thing that would make the sunk cost into the campaign worth it would be if the Russians surrendered after losing Moscow, which they did not. What made the campaign go from a failure to complete disaster, however, was Napoleon's belief that the Russians would surrender after having lost Moscow. He waited too long in the city, and winter caught up to them. By the time they were leaving, snow was beginning to fall, and at that point, there was nothing Napoleon could do except march on and try to get out of Russia. Winter was the single worst condition to fight under during the Napoleonic period. The cold made everything harder, and it made fighting extremely difficult. Trying to operate a musket with frozen fingers, march with legs with frostbite on toes, it was difficult. And yet the army marched on, constantly harassed by Russian forces, Cossacks, partisans. The retreat devolved very quickly into groups just trying to escape with their lives. It was made even worse by the fact that the Russians prevented the army from going down a different route than it had initially advanced on, meaning the terrain that they were traversing to get out of Russia was the same terrain that they had already looted anything of value from before. Napoleon invaded Russia with a force of roughly 500,000 men. By the time they reached Moscow, that force was down to only 100,000. And by the time they left Russia entirely, that force was 10,000. The fact that they escaped at all is amazing. The failure of the Russians to capture Napoleon or wipe out the last of his army would come back to haunt them, as in 1813, Napoleon, having raised new troops, was able to once again contest the Russians, even with the Prussians now joining and eventually the Austrians. A large part of this, however, is that while the French suffered attrition throughout the entire campaign, so did the Russians. They had it slightly better because they were the ones retreating through friendly territory, making them able to live off the land to a greater extent than the French, and leaving very little behind for the French to use. Even so, however, they suffered nearly as bad as the French. They just had the ability to raise more troops, as it was Russian territory that the fighting was taking place on. By the time the Russians left Russia in pursuit of the French, only roughly 40,000 of them were combat ready at the time. Now, 40,000 is not a very high number. However, in comparison to the French with only 10,000, they were still in much better condition, especially because there were many more troops who, after some time reorganizing, would be able to be ready for the push into Poland. The 1812 invasion of Russia is often viewed from the French perspective, and that makes sense. They took immense casualties, and it was a very solid turning point in the wars against Napoleon. However, the Russians suffered just as badly as the French did. They, however, were able to replace their losses as they were in Russian territory. That all changed, however, once they left Russian territory. The reason Napoleon was able to put up such a fight in 1813 is because the Russians were not able to send nearly as many forces at the French during this time period than when they were in Russia itself. This was not a new issue, however, as the Russians had suffered this problem during many of the campaigns, where Russian reinforcements were slow in arriving. Ultimately, one of the major reasons Napoleon lost is because he was simply not able to raise as many troops as the massive coalition against him, and they slowly ground down his forces until he was simply not able to defend France.